Welcome back to Story Deep Dive with Dana and Rachel. This is a podcast with book coaches, editors, and besties where we discuss books, but not as readers. We discuss them as writers so that we can draw inspiration from great books and lots of laughs and just get to jam on the things that are our, well, I was going to say jam on the things that are our jam. It's probably not the right way.
Hell yeah.
Come on. But we get to talk all things book and get to like pick some really great books. And this month is no exception. As we continue our conversation with a Rachel pick, we always know when, I think they will start knowing the differences between our selections, but this is a great pick. And today we're going to be talking about The Plot in The Woman in the Library by, please don't let me butcher her name, Rachel.
Sulari Gentill.
Come on, y'all. If you're watching the video, I might point at her and let her just go ahead and handle that for your girl.
Fill it right in.
Please help your girl out. Be a buddy to your buddy, as I like to say. But before we get into talking about plot and digging in, because we got some things to talk about on this book, I would really love to know what you got going over there at Story Cipher, Rachel.
Yes, ma'am. So fairly recently, I finished my first draft Blitz, and the community has, yes, oh my God, it almost killed me. And trying to write that first draft, with just, alongside everything else, I had to crank that thing out in a month. And it nearly did me in. I was like, oh, this is how I die. It's the first draft that kills me. So for any writers struggling through a first draft, I work as an editor professionally, and I likewise was like, holy Jesus, this is rough. So I always have to stay like a couple steps ahead of the students in the academy so I can teach and, do video demonstrations and the like. But they also have just finished their first drafts, which is a huge win for so many of them who have never completed a first draft. So to see them get through that process and lean into the inherent discomfort of writing a first draft, especially a first draft for the first time. One of the things that I've discovered is, and I've learned this through working with clients, and I got to experience it firsthand, it's good stuff, is the first draft can be so difficult and so painful because you know what you want the story to look like in your head, and the first draft doesn't look like that. It almost can't look like that because you can only do so many, you can only multitask so many things at a time. So you're kind of like getting the events down and you're getting a feel for it. And if you're on a tight deadline like we were, you don't get to futz with your prose, which everybody in the academy are prose futzers. We love our exposition. We love, our words and fiddling with them. You don't get to do any of that. You got to just get that stuff on the page. And you can feel the discrepancy between what you want your story to be and, God help us all, what finished drafts of other books look like and what the first draft looks like when you're just meeting your own story for the first time. And again, especially if you're doing this for, the first, second, or third time of, your own book, you haven't done it that many times, that squeeze doesn't feel very nice, but you have to kind of lean into that discomfort and keep showing up to the draft when it's new and messy and doesn't look like you want it to, because every first draft is going to be a little bit like that. So we got through that experience. We all survived it. And this month is a little bit of a breather month because everyone worked really hard to turn those drafts around and turn them around quickly. So we're spending this month going over how to look at your first draft and use the first draft and everything you learned along the way to plan a more intentional second draft. So we kind of treat the first draft as breaking the creative seal. Because many of us are, and I say many of us being those of us who are in the academy and the people that I work with, are prone to perfectionism. And so the first draft is an easy place to get stuck. And so rather than trying to do a ton of we do just enough planning to be able to get something down on the page so we've broken that creative seal on the project. And then we go back in and look at more closely, planning that second draft with more intention, now that we again have met the story for the first time. So this month is a little bit of a breather to take a step back, take a short break from your first draft to just like get a little space from it, and then go back to it and say, okay, what did I learn? What do I know needs to kind of change based on what I wrote in the first draft, and then planning our second draft, again, with great intention to write something a little bit more, like to be able to write something a bit more meticulously to a plan now that we have the first draft kind of behind us and we've sort of demystified that particular experience. So that's what we're doing in the Academy right now. So I have a plan in hand for my second draft. I am starting on my second draft right now. I just wrote my first scene this morning and it went way better than the first draft, I'm very pleased to say. And I'm really excited for, first of all, again, for everyone to get like a breath after just, downloading their whole story into a first draft and setting them up for the second draft, which is a great deal more fun than the first draft, because the first draft can feel a little bit like pulling teeth at this stage. So yes, I'm very pleased we're making progress. And also it's October and it's some of my favorite time of the year. Weather's getting cold, leaves are turning, spooky stuff, so I'm living my best life over here. So that's everything going on all at once. What's going on over at Danger Tales? Dana. Boy, I'm too excited for my brain to work properly.
You are. It is all good. Before we talk about what's going on over here, I want to point out, I'm so proud of you. I think there is something about, I always think it helps you to be a better editor if you are an active writer. I believe that. I believe it with every fiber of my being. And I can honestly say you feel that way on every single story. It doesn't matter how many you have under your belt. People think because you have more, it can sometimes become even more of a challenge because you have other ones, especially if they've done well or what have you. And so going into it, you always feel that way. And I always remind myself that I usually make up the time when I get into Act 3 and 4 of what it takes for me to build and assemble this thing, which is why I plot. I spend a lot of time on plotting, which is my offset. I always like to tell my clients that every book is telling us what you need as a writer to come to the page with confidence. And you don't know that until you've written. And every time you've done it, you know a little bit more and a little bit more about what it takes. So for some clients is, do I know my timeline? Do I know who's, what, when, where? Others is just I just want to get it all out and then come back. And others are like me where we like all those things laid out so that when we go through that first time, we're pulling teeth, but it's some good stuff hitting the page. And so I'm so excited for you. And I know you've been waiting to do this. So to see you do it, even if you're like, oh my gosh, listen, sometimes like I say, ain't nothing to it but to do it. You just have to get in there and just get it done and get it done. And so I'm so excited about that. But for me, I think honestly right now I have been in a whirlwind of projects. I won't even say a number because people will pass out. You'll wonder whether I am insane. But what I can say is I have been having just a great time writing and watching the students that have been in our recent program and students that were beta testers for what I'm starting to call our plug and play template for romance plotting, and watching their reviews come in, and I'm like, I knew it. Right. And so it's one of those things where it's like, because sometimes I don't, because you you can plot it, but if you don't know how to write it, then it's like, okay, but just being able to experience that and then taking a lot of that into my own process and taking it into how I'm editing and how I'm looking at diagnostics and just honestly just having a real good time of living in and sort of occupying the space where all of that hard work of building the blueprint came in, because it has really been like, okay, I'm liking the way this feels, and sort of going back to my notes and sort of, tinkering with the notes and what I like and what I don't like. Another part of this has been a very interesting progression of looking at the way that when I'm working with writers who work with AI, whether they do or they don't when it comes to plotting, and really having these discussions of what you bring to the table that a lot of people don't talk about, and that there's a lot of aspects of what we do and what we forget that we naturally do as writers that the working with AI doesn't quite get. Right? It gets it in sometimes a fundamental way, but a lot of the nuances that make it feel really like a lived in space that you're working in as a creative is not there. And that's the part where it really becomes this sort of playground to play and to work in and sort of being helping them to understand like ownership and accountability and understanding and knowing structure and what does that look like. And so seeing how that plays out too has been really nice. And so I just keep marveling at how technology has changed so much. And as someone who occupies a space on both the literary side, but also in business, seeing how business sort of embraces it and still on the literary side, it's a little bit standoffish. But for people who do, it really is a place to sort of begin to touch the top portion of your creativity that I think people think you automatically get there, but you don't without having a strong understanding about what you write, why you write it, who your audience is. And therefore, you then begin to mold and shape this creative writing partner that becomes really great, but it's only great because you are. And people think because it is this all-knowing that it understands everything, but a lot of times it doesn't. It just doesn't. But you do. And it's like, in a lot of ways, you are training it to be able to be the type of critique partner, to be able to assess the work that you've done, to be able to give you recommendations and suggestions that are in line with what you write, your niche, your tone, your style. That if you were to wake up your writing friend at 3:00 in the morning, they would say, "Girl, you done lost your mind." But chat is like, "What you got for me?" And so I think it's something that I'm starting to just be very hopeful that we won't be so standoffish as a community to it, because there is so much potential there that I just feel like I hate being with a person that's like, "Oh my gosh, don't let this moment pass you by." But I feel like that's what's going to happen to the literary world if you're not careful, that you will miss an opportunity that every other industry is sort of taking on and embracing. And so, yeah, so being able to sort of have this, it's all coming together because of between having the framework and working with people and getting under the hood of how they write and how they journey through their writing process, and to help them to sort of create and establish their own writing process, and then being able to use technology to enhance that experience. And so seeing it from different clients, different sub niches, it's just been, honestly, it's just it's dope. I don't have any other word. It's just like being right on the front row, and it's just like, this is so stinking cool. This is so stinking cool. Like, so yeah. So that wasn't what's going on at Danger Tales, but it is, clients and them having wins and people releasing books every week, and between across the board, which has been really great. Our collaborations are going on right now. We are knocking on the door of getting to our Christmas one by the time this airs, and I will be so thankful, because it will mean the collaborations will be done. But we've had such a great run, such great reviews. Like, it's like 10 times better than it was last year. And so, and of course, I'm already planning for 2026. And so, yeah, yep. So everything and a little bit of nothing. I don't know if we ever are doing nothing.
Never nothing.
I know,
It's
but
only
it's just
everything.
like, okay, all of the things. Okay, all of the things. So with that said, y'all, let's go ahead and get in the driver's seat of this conversation as we talk about the woman in the library. And before we get into the discussion of plot, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to give us our summary. And then we're going to get into our second episode of this book. So Rachel,
Yes,
take
ma'am.
it away.
So in The Woman in the Library, four strangers are united by a single moment, a single scream, while sitting next to each other in the Boston Public Library. What follows is an amateur sleuth investigation among four friends: tatted psychology student Marigold, Harvard law kid Whit, dashing author Kane, and our protagonist Freddie, a writer on fellowship working on her debut novel. But as this new friendship unfolds, so too do secrets. The biggest one of them might just be a killer.
So I've already said this. This is Rachel's pick. I don't even think I needed to say that, but y'all already know. Your girl is going to be falling back in the cut. I got a million questions and a million notes because I enjoyed the story, which you would have heard in the overview, but that is just the precursor to what we're going to jump into today. And we sort of had a pre-discussion like we normally do around what we'd like to sort of talk about in this episode. And I'd love for you to sort of maybe give us an overview of what you want to talk about. And then I will kind of bring up the rear and then we'll dive in like normal.
Yeah, sounds good. So the big, three things that I really want to talk about are, first of all, peeling away the layers of our main characters as a way of escalating the stakes and as a way of creating that upward escalation throughout the story. So it doesn't feel flat, but it feels like it's rising action and it's getting juicier and more interesting. And we feel that escalation even without as much of that experience of when we usually think of escalating stakes, we think about more people dying and more stuff happening, and it's not quite like that, but it still feels like it's escalating. Also about our protagonist as an amateur sleuth and how Sulari Gentill created setups so that her non-expert sleuth, who has little to no access to, information, law enforcement, that kind of thing, is actually able to solve the crime. And then the use of secrets, which is some of the bread and butter of a good crime story, and how she makes use of those as a part of the sort of unfolding of the crime and the story itself.
Okay, the few things that I have, and I feel like I'm going to end up wrapping them around as you talk because I think our notes are really close. I will say that just to the listeners as well as the viewers, my notes are going to be different because I may be like some of y'all. This was the first time that I read a story like this, or at least that listen, this sounds so bad, that I paid attention. But that sounds so bad, but it's all good. Okay. Some of the things that stood out to me when it came to plot is I really was fascinated of the way I have it written two different ways. One is the container for the story, and the other way was how she wrapped the plot. And what I mean by the container for the story, you said it really well, which is like books about books, which was on the cover. But then the way that it was wrapped in that she sort of told it through the lens of the fictitious character, and also it was the writer and the protagonist in the story that she was telling, right? And so it's this sort of double layer that's coexisting that I found very, very fascinating. So that's one. So the container and how she wrapped the plot. The other thing that I think that is in alignment with your use of secrets is looking at things like red herrings, misdirection, and secrets, and the usage of that in this story. I absolutely loved it. I'm not going to lie. It frustrated me a little bit because I just want you to tell me already. Listen, I know I'm not the audience for it. But I was just like, and I couldn't figure it out, which was frustrating.
Which means she's doing it right.
It does. But I felt like that old sitcom was damn. Like, tell me already. So that was the second. And then the third thing, I have it down as pacing. And this is where I sort of had this moment where you have this balance between how she did it in a sense of how the story unfolded. And I found that there's sort of a difference, and I think you're going to talk about this a little bit more, where we have the heady knowledge of what's happening and how we're sort of going through the puzzle and understanding the clues and all that, versus what I'm usually used to, which is a visceral, more heart racing sort of moments in a story where you have murder and things happening and things are unfolding. And so I found like this was a nestle between two worlds where I was sort of familiar with. And I found that I liked it, but I would have been better equipped if I would have known that that's what I was getting myself into. But I kind of just categorized it as pacing. I think she did such an amazing job in how everything rolled out. But once I understood like what playground I was in, it made it even better. But overall, I felt like she just did a great job, especially for chapters to not be that long. Like they really hit. They were very immersive. And so for her to have that sort of dual sort of stories unfolding, that made it even better, without it feeling like, oh my, like it wasn't edge of the seat moment per se, but it was very enthralling. Like it kept my attention and my focus. And so with that said, I'd love for you didn't mention it, but you did in our pre-call. So if you could just mention the whole thing about this being a fair play mystery before we kind of go into the topic of peeling away the characters. I mean, we will talk about characters in next week's episode, but this is really using characters in connection with the plot unfolding, which we've talked about with many of the books that we've had, and how doing this makes for a better story. But this, she does it in a very unique, I think it's unique because I don't read in this area. Everybody could do it. I don't know, but to me
it is unique. It is. Okay. It's yeah. She really. I think Sulari Gentill did something really special with this book, which is why I chose it, and which is why I feel like I talk about it all the time. Maybe I don't actually, but it feels like I talk about this book a lot. So, because the thing is, and this actually wraps pretty nicely into the way that she sort of peels away layers of characters, and it kind of fits right in this idea that this story is a true fair play mystery. And what I mean when I say fair play mystery is that she doesn't withhold information, but she plays fair with it. So we have all of the information sitting in front of us to choose from, like to sort of pick through and attempt to synthesize in our own way, and kind of like, because we are trying to guess who the killer is. And she makes this question that much more immediate because our pool of suspects are immediately surrounding our protagonist. And so fair play mystery, and generally murder mysteries, like if you're going to, so we talked last episode about sort of the spectrum of crime novels. Murder mystery, the expectation is that you play fair with your audience and that they will be able to guess the killer, but because you were very clever with your misdirection, your red herrings, and your use of the secrets and the interpretations, that you aren't able to guess it correctly, so that when they explain it at the end, you're like, oh my gosh, like it was right there, but I didn't see it. And that's the essence of the murder mystery and making it fair play. And that's really the fun of it. Like, this is one of the reasons people love murder mysteries, is because it's a mental puzzle that you get to go through working to solve. And then if the writer can still pull one over on you and surprise you, then you like it all the more, because you want to try to guess, but really what your reader wants is to be wrong, though. Like, they want to think that they've got it, and then be so surprised by the true interpretation of events and clues on the page that they're like, their mind's kind of blown. That's really what you're after with a murder mystery. And again, that's why I say fair play, because all of the information is right there for us to interpret and make our guess, and then we see how it synthesizes at the very end. And so so much of this information comes from the characters themselves, because they are our cast of suspects. So there are main cast of like secondary characters, and there are suspects. And so the way that she sort of crafts this is the story starts with these people meeting each other for the first time, and they bond over this, really bizarre shared experience. And so as their friendship progresses naturally, as a friendship does, as they spend time together, they learn more about each other. But what they learn about each other is relevant information to the case. And that's what makes that really so clever, is it's not just like, I'm getting to know my friends. Also, there's a mystery. The information that we're given about the friends is the information that's telling us something about this mystery that we're trying to solve. And so as the story progresses, so they get to know each other more, which means we get deeper and deeper layers of information. And I've talked about this, I think it was in the Whistleblower episode, where I talk about one of the ways that you escalate in a crime story is by deepening layers of information. By the information that we get gets deeper, and we get to sort of like, if we start on the surface of initial information, it gets deeper as we get further into the story. So our stakes escalate by going deeper, in a way. And so as they get to know each other, and the information we get is more and more personal, it gets unraveled to a point where we can see potential motive for every individual character and potential opportunity. And all of a sudden they're getting to know each other, and on one level we're like, well, that's nice. But then they drop, information about themselves where we're like, oh, hey, hang on, wait a minute. So what? Right? And it keeps us guessing, because at every moment, as we learn more about each character, our attention is turning from one character to the next of, oh, it could be them. Wait, hang on, there's this information over here. It could be them. And she uses that to keep us looking back and forth at all the different characters, trying to guess like what the truth is and who did it. So she perfectly married this sort of friends getting to know each other with like the murder mystery, and how that information actually makes up the contents of our clues and our growing understanding of the case itself.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you're saying that. I found that so fascinating, and of course my brain was going, like, how in the heck do you plot that? Like, how do you, like, what comes first, what comes second? And just thinking about it as someone who loves thinking about suspense stories, but it's almost as if it's almost as if you are looking at it from a different perspective. Like when you're writing a suspense, you may be thinking about like what got us here to this point. But this story sort of played out in both of those arenas of like what happened before is what came out as those layers were being pulled back. But it was relevant to right now because of these different crimes that are happening, right? First it was the body, then it was, a stabbing, then it was an attack, like as these are sort of progressing. And so yeah, I found that fascinating. As you're talking about the peeling away and looking at it from a sense of this plot, to me, I thought that peeling away also sort of, we saw that displayed in how she wrote the story, in that it was done through both Freddie's eyes, who was the character in the story, but also through Hannah, who was the person who was supposedly writing the story.
Yeah.
And I think we normally would say this in a caveat in our overview, but I should have said it in the opening of that. We do our absolute best to not have any spoilers. So Rachel will keep it to listen. She don't tell you nothing, and ask me. Listen. No, we ain't gonna put on a recorded line. Ask me off the recorded line how I know, okay? But how we are introduced to the characters, how those characters unfold, the things that they choose to withhold, the things that they choose to disclose, and I think pairing that against the what I just said was the container of like a book about a book, it felt juicy, but it also felt a little bit odd, right? Like that you really would have to be a person that fascinates you in general, right? To read a story about a story. But the other part of it is that she did it in such a way that it kept me present, and it also fed me information that I did not know as someone who isn't a normal reader of this genre. And so, the little things that she would get from Leo here and there when he was like, oh, that's the, the infamous da-da-da plot or whatever, or trope or whatever. And I'm like, okay, I know that one, So it kind of was almost like, it's almost like when you get to the end of a chapter and it's like, here are the 3 takeaways that we talked about, We're like, come on, help a sister out. So, but as those things were pulling back, it was just, I found it really interesting to think about how she progressed and how she sort of spoon-fed the information, not just for the overarching plot, but also to sort of tip our attention from one place to another. And I thought it was a very clever way to almost be manipulative, right? But a very clever way in how you handle the details or the facts of the story. And so I enjoyed it a lot. And I'll tell you all that are listening, and I told Rachel, I would definitely read the story again, because there is so much that I probably will overlook on subsequent reads that right now I'm really into because it's the first time. But then there are also a lot of those little things that I would understand more once after you've read it 2 or 3 times. You know what I mean? So yes. So when we think, you talked about the escalating of the stakes, the cast as suspects, their motive, the opportunities. This leads us directly into the fact that this is an amateur sleuth story. And this amateur sleuth is a writer, an Australian writer who is in America. They were at Yale. Where were they?
No, they were in Boston.
In Boston. Okay. Why do I feel like ever since we read Ninth House that I keep hearing about people like looking at the same sort of institutions? But yes. But
probably
let's
because
talk.
they're the famed Ivy Leagues, right? You've got Yale, you've got Harvard, and so these sort of these Northeast cities that are that stand in in our minds as the quintessential institutions of learning, and the cities that sort of sprung up around them or that spawned them. I'm not sure which came first, but so we've got and also you've got a very literary culture, and you also have this kind of funny benefit of they're also at least Boston, right? When you're in Boston, being very walkable, which sort of simplifies other aspects of the story as well. So yeah, the Northeast I feel is sort of this sort of romantic vision of the literary life a little bit, because of the institutions and because of its sort of history as well, the history of the literary tradition there. And so it makes it a very appealing sort of setting, if you're familiar enough with it, to pull it off, which I don't know how well Sulari Gentill knows Boston, but she sure writes like she does. And I know that Leigh Bardugo, she graduated from Yale. So she was a member of one of the secret societies, all of that stuff, she knows very deeply firsthand. So yeah, so the Northeast is kind of a romantic place to set books about books, I think.
I also find that it's very helpful because it helps to contain the setting, right? And that it really did keep it the scope very narrow. Yeah. And that helps when you have so many moving parts, because there were a lot of moving parts and there's a lot of people. I mean, it's not you can have more in a cozy, right? But it still was quite a few that you're sort of tracking in your mind with what's going on. So with that said, you wanted to also bring in talking about the fact that this is an amateur sleuth story. And we had Freddie, who is telling the story as the novelist. And then you have, Freddie, that is the character in the novel that Hannah is writing. Come on, yes. Dana. Because, girl, I had to, listen, I always be butchering names. I had to remember those names because there was too many people. Because I was probably blaming them all at one time. I know it's Marigold. Look, I was blaming everybody. But yes, let's talk about the fact that the amateur sleuth.
Yes. So amateur sleuth is one of your sort of varietals of detectives, right? So you can have a police detective, you can have an FBI agent, you can have a journalist, you can have a lawyer, and you kind of, you get the spread. So like a journalist like Gil Peck in The Whistleblower, a lawyer like Mickey Haller in the Lincoln Lawyer series, a police detective like Harry Bosch, and then an amateur sleuth like your Sookie Stackhouse or your Freddy character. And each one presents different, basically like obstacles and opportunities, right, for the story. And you have to really curate your investigation based on what kind of role your protagonist plays, because that determines what they have access to. So police detective has access to basically all of the case information that they can gather, but they're under very specific strictures because there's appropriate evidence collection, there's the risk of stuff being thrown out, in court if it's not collected properly, that kind of thing. And so for an amateur sleuth, your really big kind of problem is that they're just somebody. They're not connected to the law enforcement system in any way, which means nobody is really obligated to tell them anything excepting public record. And open investigations are not public record anyway. And so the way that you have to shape a story like that is you have to create setups so that your non-expert sleuth with little to no access to information can still somehow reasonably solve the crime. And that's your biggest issue to contend with usually with your amateur sleuth. And Sulari Gentill gets around this by making the friends the main suspects, right? So because of their means and motives, our sleuth is able to investigate and collect information first unknowingly, because she's just getting to know these people. She doesn't think any of them is a killer. She's just like, I'm meeting new friends. But, there's this sort of level of dramatic irony for us as readers, because, again, literally on the back of the book, like, it tells you that, like, one of these new friends might be a murderer. And so we know. So when we're getting to know them, we're already, if you read the back of the book at any rate, you're sort of like sizing up and you're like, okay, all right, like let me just, you got one eye, one good eye on them. And she's just sort of unknowingly getting to know these people and getting information until eventually, right, she is knowingly now trying to understand what actually happened. And she's sort of gathering information to try to understand the truth of the case. And that was the ultimate workaround for having an amateur sleuth, because now she doesn't really, she can get some amount of case information off of the news, off of, there's an investigating detective that talks to her, and so she can kind of pick up little bits and pieces from them as well. And each of them gets taken in for questioning. And so, right, she gives us these very clever little opportunities to drop bits of information for our protagonist to have. But primarily we're getting the information from the suspects themselves, which is easy because she doesn't have to have any level of access except access to the friends, which she gets at the very beginning of the book. So that's the problem, and that's how she sort of uniquely solved it, which I thought was really, really clever to kind of make that work when you have a protagonist who has such limited access to the facts of an investigation.
I think she did also a great job, not just in that with the suspects, but in the extension of the suspects too, right? Of what their parents did, how they got here, etc. That was done very well. This is one of those things that I always think about ever since we started this podcast, that comes like one of those things that rises to the surface of looking at the selection of the profession of your protagonist and how that affects when you go into this other aspect. Because again, y'all, I done told y'all, we do chandelier swinging over here. If you get any sort of suspense, you talk about mafia, organized crime.
As long as he's a billionaire.
Listen. Okay, so now when I'm thinking about that, it was like, oh wow. And even as it unfolded and I was like, oh Lord, she's one of Rachel sort of mind maps. But yeah, so but how that plays out and how she looked at people, how she looked at motives, how she looked at, and even at sometimes, and she as in Freddie, and how she even had to be mindful that she could be biased. right? And she didn't say it that way, but she was like, I don't know if it's because I'm a writer and I tend to lean towards this way, or because I have feelings for these people, or I like these people and I think they're fun, but if it's clouding my judgment. And the way it's written, it's like we really are in that moment. And I think that was one of the aspects of the storytelling that I really liked, because it did feel very close in proximity to what was going on, and then just adding on the Hannah elements just pushed it over. So I loved that. The other thing that you had for us to talk about was the use of secrets as a part of the plotting as well, because there was a lot. It was like, listen, because I'm gonna let you get to the nitty gritty. She used the secrets, but also the fact of, man, you can't underestimate a good setup. Mm-hmm. The fact that this relationship was brought on by that first crime, or that murder, it meant that you were sort of taking things at face value, because you don't know these people. Yeah. And the time that they've known each other has been the span of the investigation. So folding that into, you can call them secrets, but the reality is, I don't know you. Yeah. And do people just go out and blurt these things when you just met someone? And so it really does look, so it goes into the secrets, but it also goes into, like, you when you're looking at starting your story in media res, when things are happening, where is that starting place, and how can you take advantage of it so that it pays in spades as the story unfolds? Because that is probably her biggest hurdle. Yeah. Is that she does not know these people the way that you would know a friend, and know their history, and know their parents, and know how they got here, etc. So yeah, let's talk about those use of secrets.
Yeah, and this goes really nicely, right, with sort of peeling away the layers of the characters. Mm-hmm. And to your point, like, the plot itself gives us, like, a believable method for uncovering those secrets, and a believable reason for not getting them sooner, right? Because to your point, it's like, when I first meet someone, I'm not like, do you want to hear about all my weird traumas and all my weird, like, that. Now, I have met some people, sometimes that does happen in conversations, but yes, not often. It's normal for someone to not jump to that when you first met someone.
Oh, please, we would like for you not to. You just hold on.
Ease into that conversation. And that's what we get here, right? It's like, it starts with, I don't know you, and now we've just met, so I get, again, that first layer of information about you. Well, what do you do? Where are you from? Like, well, why are you here in Boston? And then, as we go through the story, as we get to know people, we get those more personal details about, that's again feeding us sort of means and motive and possibility, which keeps us looking at every person, because every person in our group of friends has, what you would consider what are sort of quote unquote secrets, but it's just information that we don't have any reason to know yet. Mm-hmm. And secrets are the bread and butter of a crime story. We love our physical clues. We love our, suspect interviews. We love overhearing stuff. But really, we want the majority of our cast to be withholding information, because that's what's going to give the protagonist a reason to talk to them and a reason to come back around and talk to them. And it's going to, because, to the same reason why we don't share our most intimate details when we first meet someone, there are all kinds of people in your story who maybe don't want to share certain details because they're not comfortable, because they have something to hide that isn't the murder, right? And that's one of the ways that you really fuel your story with intrigue and interest, is by having different characters withholding information that isn't, I did it. And that will keep your story unraveling throughout the whole thing. And so using the details that people are withholding, again, just naturally as a consequence of how well they do/don't know each other, gives us that opportunity to peel away more and more information to give the story that drive. Because every time we encounter these characters, we learn a little bit more about, How did they know the victim? Why are they here in the first place? What kinds of things did they decide they didn't want to share when they first met new friends that they thought might make them feel differently about them? And just unpacking. And so again, the use of secrets as combined with information people are withholding naturally, and also information that people are like, I withheld this intentionally because I don't want to share this. Like, I don't like this detail. And so, like, it takes time for that to kind of come to the surface. And sometimes it comes to the surface because of other events in the story that are like, okay, I should probably tell you about this thing, you know? And so you're getting all of these different instances where that information keeps cropping up, and that's contributing to that overall escalation of the story as the case gets more interesting and our suspects all look a little more suspicious every time we run into them, and we keep finding out more and more. And it's making us more and more suspicious of every single person. So we still don't know where to look because we're like, it was you, wasn't it? And then someone else comes in with something and we're like, hang on, maybe it was you, you know, and it just keeps that mental escalation, right? And so I think this is a good opportunity to kind of talk about, too, just sort of like springboard that into the conversation of sort of the mental stakes versus like the visceral stakes.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, because you really were tap dancing on that, because to me, as you're talking about that, it made me, again, my caveat is this is not normally my jam. Okay, I enjoyed it, but it's not my jam. So my thing was, I was coming at it looking, well, as I got into it and started really listening to the story and reading the story, then I was trying to tether it back to something that was relevant so I could kind of figure out where it fit. And we talked about a little bit of this in the overview, but in a sense of like, okay, I'm familiar with cozy, right? And then I'm familiar with like your thrillers, your suspense, and then thinking about my physical mental reaction as I'm reading the story, because I felt like it felt very almost chillax, like I was present, but it wasn't like, oh my gosh, my heart's racing, what's about to happen, like I would normally have in a story that I would be reading, right? As stuff is kind of, the pace feels almost like, again, visceral, versus here, it didn't feel like that at all to me. And so everything progressed and you felt the stakes increasing, but it was without that sort of like, I don't know, gut punch of it or whatever. So I'd love to hear more about that, because that's something where I feel like I would need to read a few more stories to really wrap my brain around, okay, what am I looking at and how was this achieved, so that I understand what that means to the reader expectations when it comes to this type of novel.
Yeah, so this kind of goes back a little bit to what I was talking about earlier, where it's almost like the way that stakes escalate in a crime story is almost more like the stakes go deep rather than up the way we traditionally think of them. So, when I'm working with my action adventure fantasy clients, we are looking at, okay, how is the danger getting closer? How are the, if we're looking at, I don't think about something like Mistborn, where how is the violence increasing? And sometimes you'll see that in a crime story where it's like, oh, more bodies drop or that kind of thing. But it's not always like that in a murder mystery where, we do have some attacks and some threats. So there is this kind of lingering threat, and you can feel that there's sort of like, it's really providing motivation to want answers, right? It's sort of like, it's more out here pressing down versus on the ground actively attacking us sort of directly, and our protagonist is like, I'm on the run for my life. And so the way that a crime story stakes escalate is more about the complexity of the case. So we find out that more people are lying, and so rather than making our heart race, it makes us sit up and lean forward for a different reason, because we're like, wait a minute, what do you mean this person was lying? Or we get a new piece of evidence that's like, what do you mean this person had a history of this thing, or there was a report filed against them for this reason, or whatever. And so it's like, which is why it gets funny when I talk generally, I'll teach or do something, about the 4-act structure. And I always have to kind of be extra broad because I deal in fantasy and I deal in crime, and what those escalations look like can be very different. And so I have to talk about, how is the problem, not necessarily just getting closer to the protagonist or the people they care about, but how is the problem getting more complex? How is the case looking increasingly unsolvable, or moving us toward this sense that the truth is maybe worse than what we initially thought that it was. And these are the ways that you're escalating stakes in a crime story, by making us more intrigued by the new information we're getting and the case getting more complex. And again, that truth looking potentially, as one means, looking uglier than we even initially suspected. So these are all the different kinds of ways that a crime story can escalate without it being protagonist on the run, bodies dropping, or that kind of rather than the heart racing stakes, we get that the mental sort of stimulation stakes of we're squinting our eyes and we're looking closer and we want more, because this new information, it's almost like it's giving us like a little dopamine hit, right? Of like, oh. And then we want to lean in and we want to keep going because we want more of that information. And the information is getting more interesting and more complicated and more, potentially more sinister and all of that kind of thing. And that's really, especially when you're dealing with a murder mystery and not like a hardcore crime story where it is gritty and you might have more of those kind of life and death stakes or more of those bodies dropping. But where the murder mystery is much more of a mental exercise and puzzle oriented, that's where you're getting that momentum in the story and that sense of leaning in and making us want more and escalating those stakes in that particular way, when you're working under these kinds of constraints that are heavily determined by the puzzle more than anything else.
Hearing you say that, it makes it clearer. I always dislike the fact that when you think about categories in Amazon, how they always lump mystery, thriller, suspense, and I'm always like, mad. They are so different. Yes. And it makes it seem as if they are the same thing, but in reality they are not. And the differences are vital to you having a story that really hits reader expectations, right? And so that you saying that makes a lot of sense, because to me it affected, I felt like for what was going on, the pacing felt very chillax. But at the same time, it was constantly evolving. And the thing that caused it to evolve wasn't always another, like a stabbing or another body found, etc. But it was equally as important, because it's almost as if it was like whenever you play pool and you hit one ball and all the other balls sort of readjust on the table. That's sort of what was happening every time a piece of information that seemed on the surface so clear cut. And it's like, it's anything but clear.
Yeah, 100%. And that's, that's why this particular book, I think, is such a great, if anyone's looking for a modern murder mystery, right? So like not in Agatha Christie, but something a little more modern, that takes place in modern day and that has, sort of modern trappings. This is a really, really great one to read, to get a feel for what do we do in every scene in a murder mystery, and like how do we escalate those stakes, and how do we keep the story moving, and how do we keep it interesting and keep the reader engaged. This one is a great one to look at for, if you're thinking about writing one, or if you're new to murder mystery. Now it does have the complication of that framing narrative, but I think if you go into it knowing that there's a framing narrative, so it's like you've got a story and then a story within a story, that at least can help set the expectation for what you're going to experience. But that's also like, that's a part of her kind of innovating as well. And so getting to see, how writers in a very, murder mysteries, I think it was the 1930s when the Detection Club was first formed. So that's when you have like, detective stories were being written before then, but you have the real, like the real rise of detective stories in popularity in the classic murder mystery. And so they've been around for quite a long time, and how writers are continuing to surprise their readers and innovate in a genre that is like, how many puzzles can you make? And the answer is actually a whole bunch. And that's kind of the fun. I think, you know, it's kind of like romance in that way, right? You're like, well, how many different ways can two people get together? And you're like, oh, actually a whole bunch. And likewise, how many ways can you murder someone and then catch the murderer? A whole bunch. And so seeing how writers are keeping the genre alive and fresh and adding their unique spin to it, this one is such a great one to kind of look at, to get a feel for that sort of murder mystery plot and how it functions and how to work with a puzzle like that and kind of drip feed that information and reverse engineer it.
One of the things that I did not have on my list, but I think it would be great to sort of touch upon, because I wouldn't be me if I did not. I absolutely love that there was a subplot of the romance, and that but it was so important to point out that how it affected the investigation, and even I mean, technically, if you will, more than one, and how it affects the investigation was so important. How it affected the way the amateur sleuth, because all of them are sort of helping to investigate, so it's several of them, but how it helped Freddie and how it helped or hindered, right, as they moved on. The other thing that I think was very interesting, that was something that was here when it came to the plot, was the whole dynamic of, I need a better way of saying this, but I always just say like mundane task, like other little ancillary things that they're doing, and it feels almost inconsequential, but it really is important. So things like how he was explaining the differences between Australia and America, and even when they had the conversation about whether the characters were black or not, and things like that, like those little bitty things really added a lot of like flavor to it, that it just made me feel like, oh, I like the way this writer writes in general. You know, I'm like, I pay attention to line by line, but that's not normally my bag. Like my bag is the overall story, and if you pull me in and keep me there until I get to the end. But I did like those touches, because it just felt innovative. And so now I'm curious to read other stories to see, okay, maybe it was a little bit, but this is normal because I don't, again, read it. So with that said, are there any final things that you think are important to look at when it comes to plot, when we think about The Woman in the Library, both as being a murder mystery, but also in being a fair play mystery? And I'm so glad that you explained that, because that makes total sense. Because I think I would have been out of my mind if it would have been something that's twisted out of place and it was used in it wasn't like you want it to be, so that when it hits, they look back and be like, oh, I can see how that happened, or how that slipped past me. So are there any other things that you think are important, especially because I know you recommend the story a lot, that it has a lot of mechanics that are at play, that I'm sure that anyone that is looking to read this book or study this book can find themselves sort of copping a squat in this book for months, because there's just so many layers. But is there anything else that you would want us to touch on and share, other than read the book?
No, nothing that I haven't already mentioned. So I do want to just kind of like highlight what you mentioned about there being kind of a romantic subplot in there. This is also a great example of adding a romantic subplot to your story that matters to the story. Like, it's not just like, also on the side I'm falling in love, and it's like, you know, you're just sort of like, what, like, as though when the lovers are together, it just feels like we're like, okay, so are we in a different story? Like, what's happening? Like, it doesn't seem to matter. But making the romantic subplot matter to the story, and letting it directly impact the investigation, directly impact the protagonist and what she does and how she does it and why she does it and how she interprets information, and to use that as just another avenue to complicate the story and add layers to it in ways that matter. So this one is, a great example. If you are writing a crime story and you also want to have a romantic subplot, this is a really good one to look at for meaningful romantic subplots. as opposed to an old crime in particular, like 90s crime sometimes get a bad rap because you've got these like male writers writing female characters who are just like leggy blondes who are just also there because I don't know, they are, you know, and it's kind of got that feel where it feels like it's like, it doesn't even feel like decoration tacked on. It feels like it almost is just like, why is this here? But actually pulling that in meaningful ways and wrapping it up in the plot to make the plot better, to make the story better, and to complicate everything. So definitely just, I'm glad you mentioned that because I was so focused on the mystery stuff, I sort of forgot that was, was a part of it. But yeah, if you're looking to write a murder mystery, if you're curious about, this is definitely one that you want to spend some time with, of like, read it first as a reader, experience it, and then go back and say, okay, how is she dripping out the information? What kind of clues are we getting? When do we know we're getting clues? And when are we getting clues and we don't realize that's what's happening, right? That's a really big one that you're looking at for a murder mystery as well. So that's pretty, and then how the case gets more complicated too as we go, and how that information gets more interesting and a bit juicier as we go. So those are the kind of like, this is like your last minute end of podcast quick bullet summary of things to maybe look for in the plot.
Yeah, there was one more thing as you were saying that sort of came to me, like her biggest issue was ignorance, right? Not as in not being intelligent, but in the things that you didn't know about people, know about the surroundings, know about the past. That just, it was just like, because some of the stuff I was just like, oh, baby, she was a little too chill on some of those revelations. I was like, listen.
You're like, what are you taking that in stride for? What?
Girl. And it was a couple of them. I was like, oh, heck no. You ain't got to go home, but you got to get the hell out of here. I said that more than once. So with that said, everyone, I think we have knocked this episode out of the park. If you have not heard me say it already, don't forget to just go ahead and grab this book. All of our books, we try our best to have books that you can purchase in multiple formats. If you go to our show notes, you can see it pointed to. I try my best to find the links to the author's website so they can let you know all the different retailers, or you can find the book versus just picking one. You can pick the one that suits your buying style, because I know Rachel and I have different buying styles. So we want to catch everyone. And we will continue this conversation when we get to next week's episode, which is going to be on the characters. And I like that we were going to talk about the characters. I mean, it's our normal flow, but in this case, because the characters was a big part of the plot, and now we're looking at how she created these characters to support this type of storytelling. And I think it's going to make it even juicier. So if you haven't done so already, don't forget to visit us online at storydeepdive.com. Make sure that you give us, rate our show, leave a comment. We're going to do a push or something so we know you're listening, and let us know if you have any questions, especially if this is your kind of jam. We would also like any sort of book recommendations that you have, because we are at this time planning our 2026 reading list so that we can keep the party going. So before I close this out, is there anything else you'd like to say, Rachel, before we say our goodbyes?
No, ma'am. I think we hit everything and then some, but I can't wait to come back next week to talk about characters.
Alrighty, well then that is it. So with that said, we will see you all really, really soon. Take care, and as always, happy writing. Goodbye.